Hi, my name is Jake Kim, and it is good to be back with you. Today, I want to talk to you about growth and how growth is hard. Have you ever watched those TV shows or videos or movies where the person gets to the victory at the end and they're cheering and it's great and the movie crescendos and that stuff? My favorite movies like that always have scenes before that victorious ending where the person went through a lot of struggle. And one movie in particular, Rocky, comes to mind. That, when the Rocky music turns on, it's actually not when he's winning, it's when he's growing. It's when he's going through things that aren't easy, but they're making him great. They're transforming him. Something I find really interesting is when you look at people like in the weight loss domain, they'll have before and after pictures. And I've said to myself before, it's not really fair that they just show a before picture and an after picture, because all the really important stuff happened in the middle and there's no picture there. And the same is in our lives, the same is in Christianity, the same is in discipleship. It's the journey that makes all the difference. And that sounds cliche, but it's in that middle section. It's in that middle part that's where all the growth happens. And let's be honest, it's not easy. Pope Benedict says, and I'm paraphrasing, the world will offer you comfort, but you're not made for comfort. You're made for greatness. And yeah, that's cool to put on a t-shirt and it sounds inspiring, but it's actually true. We're not made for comfort, but boy, it is really popular. And it's something that I'm sure drawn to a lot of my life, but it seems to leave me shallow, hollow. And I have to say, some of the most difficult times in my life, when I've gotten through them and, survived or maybe even handled them okay, I'm really grateful for how it changed me and how it transformed me. It's not always the case, but struggle can be a sign of growth. The Navy SEALs, which I'm fond of, have this phrase that says pain is fear leaving your body. Now, it's a pretty intense way to put it, but the point is that we often do a lot to avoid and to push away struggle. And I think struggle can be, and possibly is, where the most transformation happens. If we look at the Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, resurrection, and ascension, the passion, death are the turning point. Without those, you don't get resurrection. And that's something that's so hard for us as Christians. We want to find a detour around the passion and the dying so that we can get to the resurrection. But that's just not how reality works. Unfortunately, haven't we tried? Haven't we tried to seek every possible way we could to get around the passion and the dying? And the point is that there are things in us that maybe aren't supposed to be there, and they need to die so that new things can come to life. I think if we make this practical, when simple tools that are effective are applied consistently, things get better. Simple tools that are effective, applied consistently, things get better. And the hard part is, one, knowing what the tool is, but I think that's a bit easier than the consistently doing. It's so nice to have a whole bunch of nice ideas and it makes us feel good. It gives us the illusion that something positive is happening, but the real work happens when we put those tools to work. So I want to share a few simple tools with you, especially tools that can be helpful when it's hard or when we're trying to grow. The first one is a very simple mode of prayer. And the reason that I turn to prayer first is because without prayer, growth is virtually impossible. As disciples, we're followers of a person, and being in relationship with that person is the centerpiece of the discipleship. That's what prayer is. It's being in relationship. And so without prayer, the discipleship isn't going to go very far because there isn't a relationship there. It'll become like Phariseeism or performance or something. But in the scriptures, Jesus said, I never knew you. And they're like, but didn't we move mountains in your name? And he said, I never knew you. Like, that's a pretty powerful criteria. We can do a lot of stuff, but we can also not know him. And so in the growth, what's essential is staying close to Jesus. And how do we do that? Is prayer. Now, it feels like the last thing you want to do because it's hard. And you're like, take the pain away, make it go away. I have a friend who's a physiotherapist, and, he will give out exercises to do. And it's funny, like what I'm hoping when I've gone to see him is I just want him to do it. I just want him to do his magical thing and make all my pain go away. But that's not the reality of the process. And I think a lot of times we think that the Christian life is more like God puts us, under, and then he does the surgery and we wake up and we're all better. And there are times of that in the spiritual life, but more often than not, it's like physiotherapy, where we have a dear, dear friend who knows exactly what we need and is inviting us to participate in it. And our cooperation is essential. And it's staying cooperative that can be hard. So in this form of prayer, it's very simple. It's an acronym, A, and then 3 R's. And the A stands for acknowledge. And the 3 R's are relate, receive, respond. So what acknowledge is basically to acknowledge what's actually going on in your life, to be honest about what's actually there. And then the first R, relate, is to talk to God about it. Talk to God about the reality of life. In a previous video, I talked about simple prayer, and it's basically talking about what is happening instead of what you wish was happening with God. Acknowledge what's happening and then talk to God about what's happening. Genuinely, sincerely, here's the reality of what's going on, being honest. And then receive. It's important for us to pause in the midst of all of this growing and all of this work and effort that we're trying to put in, and to actually let God have a voice. He's the most important one in this process. And if we lose sight of God, we lose sight of the whole point of it. The point of growing is not so that we can appease him because he's so irritated and angry with us. The point of growing is because he designed us to be something that we're not. And he wants us to realize who we actually are. And he wants us to be in the closest possible relationship we can with him. And relationships ask us to grow. In a relationship with God, it's a lot of one-sided growing, right? We're the ones who have to change. We're the ones who have to improve. So that's hard, and that requires humility. It's an acknowledgement that I don't have it all together. But if we're committed and convinced that I have to have it together before I'm loved, then growth will be extremely hard, virtually impossible. It's okay to have weaknesses. It's what we do with those weaknesses that make all the difference. And God is a God of the weak. God is a God of the poor. And that doesn't just mean physically weak or physically poor. I'd say there's far greater spiritual weakness and spiritual poverty than there is physical weakness and physical poverty. All of us struggle with spiritual poverty and spiritual weakness, and God's inviting us to grow in those areas. Another concept that can be really helpful in this domain and area of growth is interpretation. Now, an interpretation is something that we do all day long, but often we don't even realize it's happening. So when life's going on, we as humans make meaning. We try to figure out what it means. And interpretation is that process of putting meaning to something. And so when we're in our process of growth, we're always interpreting what's going on. So for example, let's say that something's hard and we're trying to relate it to God. It's very easy for us to interpret that God doesn't love us. Now, imagine that in the midst of that, you really believed that interpretation, that God doesn't love me, and then you started acting on it, and that became the primary thing that you thought about. I mean, imagine how healthy would your relationship with God be if you said to yourself 40, 50 times a day, he doesn't love me, he doesn't love me, he doesn't love me. I mean, you're meditating and pondering on something that isn't true, and it came out of an interpretation of a situation. So being very mindful and very cautious about the meaning we're putting to things, it can make or break the process of growth that we're in. Another idea is, I think as Christians, we have this notion that if I fail, I'm automatically sinning. It's okay to not get it right every time, especially when you're trying to do the right thing. I think sometimes we focus on this notion that the point of Christianity is the removal of sin. That's an essential part of it. But if you look at the catechism, there's 4 primary reasons that God became man and shared the gospel with us. One of them is about our sin problem. The others are all about relationship and us becoming who we were designed to be. There's a lot more going on than just addressing sin. And if we miss that, It's another reason growth can be hard. Now, I want to offer just something that's really, really basic that comes out of the psychological world that seems like it doesn't work, but it's pretty phenomenal. And that's called breathing. I know it sounds like, what? Come on, seriously, we're going to talk about breathing. Yeah, we're going to talk about breathing because there is so much research about the power and effectiveness of breathing. And there's a whole really beautiful and cool reflection about breathing that's scriptural. Like the breath of God is what made Adam come alive, the first human. I mean, there's a lot we could get into with that, but I want to keep it practical for now. There's research that shows with very simple diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, breathing from your stomach instead of your chest, has an incredible capacity to calm people down. It activates your parasympathetic nervous system. And so when growing and it gets hard, often we forget to breathe. We hold our breath. And so simply remembering to breathe, what does that mean? Yeah, it literally means to pause and take 2 to 3 minutes and only focus on your breath. And maybe you have a phrase like, Jesus, I trust in you. And you're saying that very slowly and in sync with your breathing. It's effective. It does things on the basic natural level that can help calm us down in the midst of growth. Again, another military example from the Navy SEALs. They have this phrase that they train, and it's a 4-part little tool, but they use it in the heights of intensity. And when things are going really, really sideways, pause, breathe, think, act. And so if things are going really poorly on the battlefield, Navy SEALs have practiced this thing to where they pause for a minute and they breathe. And their principle is you cannot make a good decision if you don't have oxygen in your brain. And you can't make a good decision if you don't actually slow down to examine your options. So pause and breathe. Then they think about what's actually going on, assess, and then they act. That could probably prevent a lot of us from going down paths that we really shouldn't be going down. And the thing that's really important about that principle is that the Navy SEALs don't practice it in the heat of the moment. They practice it a lot beforehand. They practice it when things aren't really intense, because that's when we get good at the skill. So pause, breathe, think, act. I also want to remind those of you who are at the men's retreat about the basic survival tips that I offered there, because they're really helpful when we're trying to grow and when growth is hard. Notice what challenges you and captivates you. Maybe this is pretty easy in the growth process, especially if it's hard. You're really aware of what challenges you, but maybe you've forgotten about what captivates you. Maybe you've lost sight of you're captivated by the idea of being a faithful disciple of Jesus. And having that right in front of you maybe can help the process of growth. Don't self-censor. I think one of the things we feel like we're never allowed to do as disciples is to be honest about what's really going on. Obviously, God knows. And so it's okay to talk about that. It's okay to be honest about what's going on. We don't have to self-censor, especially in our relationship with God. Be curious and kind with yourself and with others. When things are hard and when we're really trying to grow, we are notorious for shaming ourselves, for being cruel to ourselves, for saying harsh things to ourselves. That doesn't help. You can't control the outcome, but you can control the kind of person you'll be in the midst of the process. Often that's what growth is actually trying to do. It's actually trying to change us. And often what we try to do is to try to change the problem instead of letting sometimes the problem change us. We can't control everything. What we can do is find the good in what's going on, surrender ourselves to God, and let growth do what it's intended to do, and that's to make us more like Jesus. The pressure is off. We get to be a student and a son or a daughter. I feel like this is so important. We're not supposed to be in a space where we are doing everything by ourselves. That's called an orphan. We're a son and daughter of God. And so when we put so much pressure on everything that's going on, the anxiety increases and our likelihood of staying in this arena, it goes down. God is kind. He's good. He is with us. When Jesus is there, things get better. And so our eyes being fixed on him is really important. And he says, take my yoke upon you. My burden is easy and light. Pressure's off. don't disqualify yourself. Have a growth mindset. And a growth mindset's a thing in the psychological world that I've really become fond of. I actually think it's a biblical thing. You have to have a growth mindset to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus, because you're always growing. And if mistakes disqualify you, that's called a fixed mindset. Christianity is impossible because we're always bumping into our mistakes. We're in a perpetual growth cycle as disciples. That's what discipleship is. It's relationship with Jesus that transforms us. And so having a growth mindset is foundational. We might have to make real decisions in our life that shift us from thoughts that are about a fixed mindset versus having a growth mindset. Failure doesn't have to be the final say. Failure could be something that helps us grow tremendously. Lastly, don't go into self-reliance. Don't try harder, train more. Self-reliance is something that St. Teresa of Avila said it killed her. It massively restricted her growth. And so when we try to do it all on our own, that's not what it's intended to be. Again, discipleship's relationship. And when we're growing, we're not intended to do this by ourselves. And so one of the things that especially men can struggle with is that we feel this pressure to prove ourselves through the difficulties that we've navigated. And the guys who usually do that come out the other side just more arrogant than they did when they started. It's supposed to bring about a transformation within us, and companions are an essential part of it. Jesus intentionally sent disciples out 2 by 2. I hope this blessed you. Talk to you again soon.